Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I wanted to show you a famous game by no other than Bobby Fischer, the legendary Bobby Fischer. And this game is really famous. You might have seen this game in many chess books, and basically the idea behind today's video was to work on endgames a little bit and see how we can convert our advantage in the endgame if we have a slightly better position. Okay, let's dive into the game. So Bobby Fischer is playing as white and black is Mark Taimanov. Two players were the best players back then. This game was played in 1971 in Candidates Tournament. And Bobby Fischer started with e4, his favorite move. And Mark Taimanov played c5. So now we have Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, which are standard moves. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, queen c7, knight c3, e6, g3, and a6. Okay, so Mark Taimanov is playing as black, and he's playing Taimanov variation. So this is kind of like Con Taimanov Sicilian defense. For those of you who are not familiar with this opening, black usually moves the queen early into the game to c7, and that is totally fine. Because the point here behind this move is to control the square on e5, and in some positions he can take the knight back with the queen, so that's why queen c7 can be played early into the game. Okay, so here white played bishop g2, so white fianchettoed the bishop, knight f6, castle, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop c5. So interesting move. And actually I remember that in one of my games from, I think, World Cup against Victoria Similite, I got this position as black and I played bishop c5 if I'm not mistaken here. So yeah, back then, I don't know, maybe it was 2006 I played in the World Cup, and then I played Con Taimanov against her. But anyway, so here white played bishop f4, which is the best move, even nowadays considered to be the best move, and d6. If black takes the queen on d4, white can take here, and here black has problems with this bishop. The light square bishop is blocked by his own pawns. So that's why in this position after bishop f4, black usually pushes the pawn to d6. Okay, so now white needs to protect the queen. White moved the queen to d2, h6, rook a d1, putting pressure on the pawn on d6, e5 to block the bishop, bishop e3, bishop g4, attacking the rook, bishop takes c5, d takes c5, and f3. Okay, so now the bishop is under attack, and the bishop retreated to e6, f4, rook d8, knight d5 to block the rook because the queen was hanging, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and here e4. Notice that in this position white is already slightly better thanks to this bishop, because as you know, bishops are usually better than knights, especially in the open positions. And here black didn't want to take the pawn, because if black takes the pawn, now okay, white has different moves here. White can push the pawn to attack the queen, but even like a simple move like rook e1 is completely fine because black king is in the center. So since white has a bishop and the black king is in the center, so black doesn't want to open up the position. That's why in the game black played e4 in this position, because he wants to keep his pawn in the center, so white cannot check the king. This is a very, very important basically factor in chess, that when the king is in the center, we do not want to open up the position. Anyway, in this position, white played rook fe1, black took the pawn on d5, and white played a very nice move, rook takes e4. The idea is that since this knight is covering 2 squares, the knight is overloaded. So overloading piece is not a good thing in chess. And after knight takes e4, white can simply take the rook, and now black is in trouble. Why? Because the knight is under attack, the king is in the center. If the knight moves, then we can check the king, and this king cannot castle because the king can't castle when the king is in check. So let's say if the king goes to f8, we can take the pawn on b7, and white is up a pawn with a better position. So that's why in the game, after rook takes e4, black played king to d8. Now, since the queen is under attack, white moved the queen to e2. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and queen d7. Okay, in this position, white decided to exchange the queens because Bobby Fischer thought that his position is better and he can basically improve his position here. So he took the queen, king takes d7, and then he played rook e5. So here is an important actually move because the rook is under attack and we need to attack another piece. Otherwise, black has time to consolidate his position. So that's why white moves the rook to e5. Now the pawn is under attack, right? And also the bishop is attacking the pawn on b7. That's why the only move here is to play b6, which was played by Mark Taimanov. Okay, so here is the first critical moment of the game, I would say. And we reach to an endgame where white is a slightly better, but not that much, right? And I know that a lot of chess players would agree on a draw in such positions, but we want to see how Bobby Fischer can basically convert his advantage in this game, or even can he convert his advantage in this game? Okay, I hope that I didn't spoil the result for you guys, but let's see what happens next. So here, Bobby Fischer played bishop f1. What's the idea? The idea is to attack the pawn on a6 and bring the bishop into the game. So if, let's say, black pushes this pawn, then the pawn on c5 will be hanging. And if black plays a5 in this position, now we have these squares available for our bishop. So after a5, white moved the bishop to c4, and notice now the pawn on f7 is under attack, so black needs to protect it. Black moved the rook to f8 because there is no other move for black to protect the pawn. The king is being cut off by the rook and the knight can't help, so the only move here is to play rook f8. After rook f8, white moved the king to g2. Very, very important point in the endgames. So I always tell my students that in the endgame we have two important factors. One is to activate your king if you can, and number two, to create a passed pawn if you can. So these two things are very, very important. If you have a pawn majority, it's a good idea to create a passed pawn out of your pawn majority. Or if your king can get into a better position, you should move your king forward or to a better side of the board to activate your king. Okay guys, so after king g2, black played king d6 in this position, and white played king f3, knight d7, attacking the rook, rook e3, knight b8. Now the idea behind this move is to transfer the knight to d4 or b4. That's why After rook d3 check, king c7, here white played c3. Now we are taking away those squares from the knight, so the knight can't move to d4 or b4. Black played knight c6, rook e3, and black played king d6. After king d6, white played a4 to block the black pawn structure. But notice that when we play a4, we're blocking the pawn structure, but this king has still a way to penetrate to black's pawn structure. So it means that the king later on can move towards b5, which is very important for us. And you will see later on in the game that white played this plan. Okay, black played knight e7, h3, knight c6. So basically black can do anything, so black should just wait here. White played h4 and h5. Okay, another thing that is very important in such positions is that since white is better and black doesn't have any counter attack, so there's no rush for white. White can just take his time, develop his pieces, put his pieces on the better squares, and just improve his position, you know, step by step. So that's why white move the pawn to h3 first and then move the pawn to h4, because sometimes you might wonder, okay, why did white play h3 and h4, not just, you know, h4 in one move? So that's the point. And also it has a psychological impact on your opponent. It means that you can't do anything, so it's a game that either is a draw or I will win. So anyway, here white played rook d3, king c7, rook d5, attacks the pawn, and black played f5. But notice that after f5, black is putting his pawns on lighter squares, so it means later on this bishop can attack them. So white moved the rook back to d2, rook f6, rook e2, king d7 here, rook e3, g6, bishop b5, the knight is pinned, rook d6, king e2, and king d8. Okay, so this is the second critical moment, I would say, and here is white to play. I want you guys to pause this video and find the best move for white. So here Bobby Fischer found a very nice idea. He played rook d3. The idea is to exchange the rooks because now the rook is pinned, and he thought, okay, I'm going to go to an end game where I have a bishop, my opponent has a knight, but he thought that he has a better position and he can win the game. Let's see what happens in the game. So black played king c7, rook takes d6, king takes d6, king d3, knight e7, bishop e8, king d5. Notice that the knight can't move because the knight is protecting here, so king d5 was played, bishop f7 check, king d6, and king c4. As I mentioned before, this king is about to move to b5. So black played king c6, and then we check one more time because the king is controlling this square and we need to get our king to b5. The king b7, king b5, knight c8. So here white needs to be super careful, because if white makes a mistake and, for example, move the bishop to d7, now black has a beautiful checkmate here, guys. Can you find it? Black can move the knight to d6 and checkmate. Beautiful checkmate, isn't it? Okay, so that's why in this position white checked on c6, king c7, and then moved the bishop to d5, because now the king is no longer covering this square a6, and if he, for example, checks here, we can simply move our king to a6. So here black played king knight e7, bishop f7, king b7, bishop b3. So white is playing a bunch of waiting moves, kind of. King a7, bishop d1, king b7, bishop f3, king c7, and king a6. As I mentioned earlier, since in this position black doesn't have any counterattacks, so white is in no rush. So king a6 was played, black played knight c8, bishop d5. The idea is to play bishop f7, knight e7, bishop c4, knight c6, and then bishop f7. So the knight moves back and bishop e8. Okay, so in this position, black is kind of in zugzwang, because if the king moves, we can take this pawn, and if the knight moves, we can take the other pawn, right? And his pawns cannot move except this pawn, but if he pushes this pawn to c4, now the c4 pawn becomes a target for white. So white can move the bishop to f7, and it's not possible to protect the pawn on c4. White wins a pawn, and then it's a winning position for white. So that's why in this position, black has just one move, which is king d8. Now the king is attacking the bishop, and if king takes b6, he wants to take our bishop. Okay, so this is the third critical moment of the game, I would say. And I want you guys to pause this video and find the best plan for white. As I mentioned earlier, this position is famous, and you might have seen this position in many chess books. It's an instructive endgame. I want you to think a little bit and find some ideas for white. Okay, so the best move here for white is to take on g6. Surprise! We sacrifice our bishop for some pawns. So the knight has to take, otherwise we're gonna just take the second pawn. So knight takes g6, and then we're gonna take on b6. Both pawns are under attack. So basically we are going to get at least 3 pawns for the piece that we sacrificed. Black played king d7, and then king takes c5 in this position, and black played knight e7. Notice that after knight e7, white needs to push his pawns as soon as possible, because if this knight can get into the king side, it can be tricky. So that's why white just moved the pawn before. So he didn't play king b5 here, because after king b5, black might play either knight c6 or knight c8 with this idea. So white wants to activate and push his pawns as soon as possible. That's why he pushed the pawn to b4. A takes b4, c takes b4, and here knight c8, a5, knight d6, b5. Our pawns are on 5th rank, so these pawns are really strong. Let's see if Bobby Fischer can win this position. So black checked on e4, that's a fork. The king moved to b6. The king needs to support his pawns. King c8, and now he played king c6. Knight didn't take on g3, he played king b8. And then here, white played b6, and black resigned at this point. But I want to analyze a little bit more to see what happens if, for example, black takes a pawn, right? This is a logical move, because you want to take a pawn, then you want to play knight e2, you want to take on f4 and create your own passed pawn and promote your pawn, right? But if he takes here, the only move that white can win here is by pushing this pawn to a6. Notice that if we push the pawn to b7, this position is draw. Why? Because knight can move to e2, and if you play, for example, king b6 with this idea to checkmate the king, black is in time. Black can take here, and after a6, black can check on d5, and this king cannot stay here to checkmate. So let's say the king moves, and we can just move the knight to f6 or b4, doesn't matter, and this position is draw. And funny enough, here white needs to actually draw the game, because the only move that draws the game here is king c5, And the idea is to get the king towards this pawn. Because let's say if I go here, he can just sacrifice, and then black is gonna win the game, right? But after knight b4 and king c5, this game should be a draw. Okay, let's go back. Let's see what happens after a6. So a6 was the best move, right? So a6, and if black wants to play knight e4, white can simply check on a7. If the king goes here, we can just promote to a queen or a rook and checkmate the king. And if the king goes to a8, then we can check on b7, which is an important move. Again, if we move the king to c7 with this idea, now black has time to play knight c5, and black is blocking this pawn. So here b7 is an important move. King takes a7, king c7, and black cannot stop the pawn. So that's why in the game after a6, black just resigned, and here Bobby Fischer won this beautiful game. Okay guys, I hope that you like this instructive game by Bobby Fischer. If you have any suggestions for my next videos, please write me in comment sections, and as always, please like the video if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon. Take care.